The Barefoot Lawyer Reports is proud to announce the publication of a research paper from the Center for Human Rights. It addresses the subject of illegal policing and surveillance centers in America and foreign countries established by the Chinese Communist Party. To read this paper, go to catholic.edu/chr and go to our Research and Analyses page.
Hi, this is William Saunders, and welcome to another edition of the Barefoot Lawyer Podcast. I am the director of the Center for Human Rights at the Catholic University of America, where Chen Guangcheng is a distinguished fellow, and he is the Barefoot Lawyer, of course, from which the podcast gets its name. Today, we are very pleased to have with us a guest, Kay Rubacek, who is a nonfiction producer and also an author and also a concerned mother. And, not to be silly, but to be truthful, all the people whose human rights are being abused are children of a mother. And I think it emphasizes for us what's so important about human rights abuses is they happen to individuals, but they affect multitudes of people because we're all people who are enmeshed in webs of relationships, and that's what it means to be a human being. So anyway, enough of my philosophy. Kay, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Kay, I would just like to start by asking you, what got your interest or what got you interested in human rights in China?
Well, to take it right back, it would be my father. He was actually born and raised in China. His parents escaped Russia during the revolution in the 1920s, and they escaped by foot. Spent 5 years traveling to find freedom, and they found it in northeast China. That was before the Chinese Communist Party took over there. My father was born and raised as a Russian boy in northeast China, and but then the Great Famine, which is not really great, killing so many people, millions of people in China, came. He was very fortunate to survive the start of that, but they had to escape again. And through their church and connections outside, they were able to go to Australia. So because of his background, my family grew up loving eating Chinese food, and we've always had this connection to China. So but the human rights abuses and my interest in that started, I guess I followed what had been happening with the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989. But then in 1999, it got very personal for me because, I was born and raised a Christian in Australia, but I also started practicing the Falun Gong meditation practice in the mid-1990s. And then they outlawed it in China. And I could not understand how you could outlaw meditation, like telling people to stop jogging in the park or stop doing yoga. So that really drove me to look at what was happening. And then when I heard that people were actually being killed, tortured to death for doing the same thing that I was doing, which I'd never paid a cent for, just came and go whenever I wanted to. It was completely, with no commitment, only my own personal choice. That's when it crossed a line for me. And I thought, well, that could have been me if my father had stayed in China. I could have been tortured. I could have been the one in the prison. And so I went to China to see for myself what was going on, and landed in a basement prison cell in China. And I was told by the Chinese police that I held a banner on Tiananmen Square that had 3 words: truth, compassion, and tolerance. And they told me those words were illegal in China, and that was the only law I'd broken, though obviously it's not a law. I did not break any law in China. But the treatment I received was disgusting and abhorrent, and opened my eyes. So I knew that barely scratched the surface as to what would happen to a Chinese national, someone who had a different skin color. And that just really propelled me to take my production skills that I had professionally and start using them to tell the stories that were being largely censored of the Chinese people under the Chinese communist regime and that weren't being largely told. So that's, I guess, that's the long of how I got my interest in China human rights.
Sure. I mean, that's very interesting. All of that was very interesting. I think listeners may know, but I mean, it's fascinating that your family fled totalitarianism in one country and then had to flee it again in a second country. And that really in both situations, it's communism. We just did a podcast, and the listeners, if you haven't heard it, I suggest you go back and listen to it, that I did with Lee Edwards, who founded the Victims of Communism Museum here in Washington, D.C. And communism, despite what some misguided young people think, have a flirtation with the idea of it, is absolutely brutal destroyer of human freedom in reality. And your story shows it, and what they have done to the Falun Gong shows it. And I think it leads me to ask you about the documentary you did, Hard to Believe. Could you tell us about that?
Yes, in 2015, I did a documentary called Hard to Believe, and I think the title was pretty apt because it's on the subject, which it's a bit more common knowledge now, and I like to think that the documentary played a role in that, though there's many amazing people who have been advocating for raising awareness about these horrific crimes in China. The worst crime that I really had heard of was the killing of innocent prisoners for the sale of their organs. And that is being done by the state of the Chinese state. It's being condoned by the Chinese Communist Party, not publicly condoned, but through the operations. And so our movie investigated why so few people are paying attention to such a horrific crime, which has been legal in China since 1984. There's been a law that hasn't changed, where the Communist Party has allowed the taking of the removal of prisoners' organs from prisoners that results in their death. Having the organ removed kills them. They don't kill them first, and they don't die first, naturally or unnaturally. And so our movie focused on how in the last since the early 2000s, the population of prisoners became largely Falun Gong practitioners. And now, because that crime wasn't stopped, it's now moved to the Uyghur population from the Xinjiang region of China. And there's no reason to say that it wouldn't spread to other populations. So they did target the Falun Gong practitioners because they generally don't smoke and don't drink, so they have quite healthy organs and healthy bodies. And it is hard to believe that a government or that any doctor would involve in killing somebody to save another person's life. And that's what we looked at, because there is that operation. Like today, you could call a Chinese hospital today and ask for a heart transplant, and you could schedule that, probably within the next few weeks, at least within the month. And if that didn't work out the first time, they'll give you another heart. And that's not uncommon. You just pay the money. And that's where communism, being atheistic and materialistic, and forcing that, they dehumanize people to the point where they just see them as parts for sale. And that's why we called the movie Hard to Believe, because it's hard to believe, it's also hard to accept, but the reality is that it's true. And since the movie came out, there's been a lot of movement and recognition of the crime that has pushed back on it, though it hasn't yet stopped, because the regime is making billions of dollars off it every year.
It is incredible. That is a great name for the documentary, because it really is. It is. in some sense, unbelievable that any organization could do it, but that a government essentially sanctions this kind of behavior, which I think is, I can't imagine any lower form of human behavior than to take a innocent person and kill them for their organs to give to somebody whose only distinction is they have money. And the irony that a communist country is doing this for the money is even puts even more of a sickening taste to the whole thing. I mean, I just want listeners to just, probably most of our listeners are aware of this, but I mean, just, sometimes you hear about a terrible thing and you let it kind of pass by your consciousness, but just think about that they take they take a person who hasn't done anything, and and the word harvest is such a inadequate word. What they really do is rip their living organs out of them to sell to somebody else. And I could go on forever, but I do want to say one more thing, which is most people, at least in America, have heard of there used to be an Aztec religion, and part of the Aztec religion was that they sacrificed people and ripped out their living hearts. What is the difference between that and this so-called organ harvesting? I don't see any ethical difference. And like you said, it's been done to the Falun Gong. It continues to be done to the Falun Gong. It has been now widely extended to Uyghur prisoners. I have no doubt that it'll be done on Christian prisoners and anybody else that, anybody in China could be subject to it because none of them have human rights. Their human rights are not respected.
You've been listening to part 1 of a Barefoot Lawyer Reports interview with human rights activist Kay Rubacek. To listen to part 2, check back next week.